Fearless Women is sponsored by the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the National Book Festival. My name is Anna Laymon, and I am the Executive Director of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. I am here today with Megan Twohey and Gail Collins, both incredible authors and writers and journalists, and I cannot wait for you to hear what they have to say. So I mentioned that I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. The commission is a very proud sponsor of the National Book Festival this year. We are the sponsor of the Fearless Women Trail, which is featuring authors who are fearless, just like Gail and Megan, but also books and stories about women throughout American history. And it's just really a privilege to be here in this place today with these two women. So I'd like to start us off with some brief introductions for Gail and Megan, and then we'll kick it off. So Megan is joining us. She is the author of She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter with the New York Times. Gail is also from the New York Times. She joined their staff in 1995 on the editorial board, later became an op-ed columnist, and in 2001, she was appointed the editorial page director. She's here today to discuss her book, which I have right here behind me. Megan, I'm going to hold your book up too. We just have to have some brief. Here we have Megan's book. Here we have Gail's book, No Stopping Us Now, The Adventures of Older Women in American History. Should we get started, ladies?
Sure.
All right. So I'm just going to kick us off with kind of an easy one. Megan, we'll start with you first. Would you tell us a little bit about your book, She Said, and how it came to be?
Sure. So the book that I co-authored with my colleague, Jody Cantor, another investigative reporter at the New York Times, came about because after we broke the Harvey Weinstein story in October of 2017, we watched with wonder as the dam broke and, women all around the world came forward with their stories of sexual harassment and abuse. And watched with wonder as the Me Too movement really spread around the world as we saw this global reckoning over sexual harassment and abuse. And we really felt like we had an obligation to continue reporting and to take readers behind the scenes of this investigation that had helped spark this reckoning. And so much of investigative reporting takes place behind the scenes and is confidential. And we really wanted to take readers, give them a front row seats to the first kind of hushed conversations we had with our sources, from famous actresses to women who had worked in Weinstein's company. We also wanted to report into what had happened on the Weinstein side. We realized that in that first story, we had been able to piece together some of the, some aspects of the puzzle of how this powerful man had been able to get away with abusing and harassing women for decades. But in reporting this book, we were able to help illuminate so many of the other factors that explained how he was able to do that. The institutions and the systems that have enabled sexual harassment and sexual assault, not just in the case of Weinstein, but in so many other industries here in the United States.
And, just so you know, as a reader of your book, you absolutely do what you set out to do. I mean, as I was reading through those pages, I felt like I was following your journey of investigating that story from start to finish. And it was gripping. I mean, it was gripping the whole way through. Gail, would you tell us some about your book, what it's about, and how it came to be?
Yeah, but I want to say first that I've written a bunch of books now about history, but it's a real privilege to be here with Megan, who made history. This was just such a huge, amazing thing. So,
Yeah.
welcome. This
Right.
book.
So nice to be with you, Gail.
Privilege
for me.
Yeah, do you know each other? Because you both work at the New York Times. So do you know each other in that space?
We have passed and met, but the opinion people are like in a whole different area of the building than the news people are. And it was sort of arranged like that because of the theory that we, were completely different, didn't talk to one another and so on.
Yeah.
So we don't get as nearly as much chance as we would like to just sort of hang out with the news side.
Right.
Yeah, this is cool for us.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I love this. Okay, Gail, tell us about your book.
I wrote a book a while back in which I ran across a letter from one of the early American colonists. They were all guys writing back and asking for people to please send them some women so they could get married and have families. And they wrote, the woman must be of good character and under 50 years of age. And I thought, wow, they're not that picky back then. And then suddenly I was remembering those ads from I think it was the 70s, you're not getting older, you're getting better ads. And they start out saying, these days, 25 is getting to be very old. And I thought, wow, we went from 50 is young to 25 is old. And how did this happen? Where did it go back and forth? And that's how I got started on the whole looking into what it was like to be an older woman at different points in American history and what they got away with and what they did. So that's
well, and I love having the two of you in conversation with each other for this panel, because what you both really get at are, right, your books are about women's experiences and women's lives, both throughout American history and now. And so there's that common thread that runs through both of these books and through your larger work, right, that both of you do. And so I think putting you in conversation with each other for this dialogue is, it's perfect. Let's pivot a little bit. Megan, your book is really about your investigation of the Me Too movement, about Harvey Weinstein. For people who haven't read your book yet, could you talk us through a little bit about, why did you and Jody decide to write this book, right? What sparked the idea of we need to put this down on paper? We've done our investigative reporting, right, that has, as Gail said, made history and changed the world. Why put it together into a book?
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons was that we realized that, as I mentioned, we realized that when we broke the Weinstein story, we had learned a fair amount about this powerful producer and his decades-long history of harassing and abusing women, but really understanding more of how is it that powerful men in this country have been able to get away with that year after year, decade after decade. And we really felt an obligation to report further into those questions, to report into the question of complicity. How was it that Weinstein worked for, Weinstein ran some of the most prestigious film companies and powerful film companies in this country, Miramax and then the Weinstein Company. We realized that these companies had glimpses of the boss's predation, including Weinstein's brother, Bob Weinstein, who was the co-founder of these companies and worked side by side his brother for years. And so, in the board of his company. And so we really wanted to report into the question of complicity. When people get glimpses of wrongdoing, what do they do in response? How do they try to stop it? Or do they look the other way? We wanted to report more into these secret settlements that have been used. Weinstein, we were able to piece together a financial trail of payoffs that Weinstein had made over the years to silence as many as 12 women who came forward with allegations against him. There was this one moment in the investigation when I was on the hunt for a woman who we thought had been sexually assaulted by him when she was a young assistant working as a young assistant in his company. And, I actually drove out to a family home of one of her family members had a home outside of New York. And I drove out there with like a handwritten note that I was going to give this family member making the case for why she should talk to us. And the woman herself actually answered the door and she said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you found me." And then the second thing she said, "I've been waiting for this knock on my door for 25 years. And yet she was legally prohibited from telling me what had happened to her. Like so many women in this country who suffer sexual harassment and sexual assault, she had been advised by her attorneys that her best option was to take money in exchange for silence. And so we really felt an obligation to try to explore more of these secret settlements and what they've meant and how they've allowed predators to cover their tracks. And so it was clear that there was much more of the Weinstein story that needed to be told as basically an X-ray into abuse of power in this country. And then we also realized that we wanted to we never could have predicted the way that the Me Too movement was ignited following, that our story had played a role in this Me Too movement being ignited. And we knew that it had come to mean so much to so many people. And so we really wanted to take people inside the New York Times newsroom and into our partnership as reporters and to watch journalism in action and see how you build an investigation like this that can have such a huge impact.
Well, and in reading your book, I was reminded that you all basically, through your reporting of this, we take it for granted now, but following the paper trail of these non-disclosure agreements, that wasn't done before you all figured out that that was a way to sort of prove a pattern of behavior. And in reading your book, I was reminded of something that now seems obvious and clear and like that. Of course, that's how this investigation happens. But no, that was just a few years ago that you all really uncovered something very important.
Well, I would actually I do a little bit of a correction to that, which is that we were actually taking a playbook that had first been created by our colleagues, Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt, who broke the Bill O'Reilly story.
That's right.
Bill O'Reilly would put more than $400 million in secret settlements to women who had come forward with allegations against him. Yeah. And, so these are women who were locked into silence through these secret settlements. And Emily and Mike were able to basically piece that financial trail of payoffs together. And when they were when those stories were published, the impact was immediate. I mean, Bill O'Reilly, perhaps the most famous and powerful figure in conservative media, was fired from Fox News, something that had seemed unthinkable just months before. And so that was really the moment at the New York Times where the editors and reporters came together and asked a question that may now seem quaint, which is, are there other powerful figures in America who have been able, who have abused women and covered it up? And that was really how the Weinstein investigation began. And we were really fortunate to be able to draw on not only some of the tactics that they had used, but, we were in consultation with Emily Steele throughout our investigation saying, like, we're trying to get these women to talk, and what do you think we should do? So there was, we were really grateful to be able to draw on their previous reporting.
Right. That's another theme, Megan and Gail, between your two books, is really giving voice somewhere where women's voices have been taken away. And Gail, I'm reminded of that in your book, right? That oftentimes with women have a very complicated relationship with aging that society has handed to us on a very dicey silver platter. And your book, really speaks to that, and it speaks to the power of that and the beauty of that and the complicatedness of that. Could you talk a little bit about, what was it like to research that topic and to sort of bring life to this topic?
I think when you do this stuff, you just read and read and read and read for a while, and then you kind of fall in love with different people in your story, and you just want to figure out more about them and tell more about them. And one of the ones, I had not been a huge Elizabeth Cady Stanton fan before the book. She had, a kind of mixed record on some things. But the thing that fascinated me was that she came up in an era when women were dying to talk about abolition and rights of women to vote. And they weren't allowed to because the idea of women speaking in public was regarded as so shocking. It was like a sexual thing. And anytime a woman tried to get up and speak in public, they'd throw things at her and say she was a horror and ruin her reputation and so on. So they didn't. And what she figured out was, I am old. I am a grandmother. Look at my gray hair. Very old. I can't possibly be a problem, right? How could you worry about this? And once she had gotten that it's safe if you're older than a woman to go out and do things, it's not the same kind of a shock. She was on trains across the country playing poker with soldiers and climbing up mountains. I mean, she just had a million adventures and spoke to a million different people. And I just sort of love the way she figured that out.
I love that. Okay, so I am the executive director of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. So suffrage history, of course, is very important to me, especially this year. For everybody out there who is listening, this year is the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote. So a very important milestone in American democracy. Gail, you talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you talk about Carrie Chapman Catt, you talk about Alice Paul, you talk about Sojourner Truth. In your book, you talk about several suffragists. One of the things that I love about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as a mom myself, is that she had, babies on each hip, babies around her skirts, and she was still just this bold, radical woman, right, her whole life. Can you talk a little bit about the investigation and the research that you did and the writing that you did about the suffrage movement in your book?
It came up a lot, and you find it in all kinds of different places. I've been thinking about it a lot this week, of course, because it came up again. And one of the interesting things, I don't think Megan thinks about this too, I've thought so much about suffrage and the right to vote, but having the right to vote all by itself doesn't really take you all that far. You've got to have more than that. You've got to have the right to speak in public. You've got to have the right to have public lives. And you've got to have income of your own. If there's one thing that what I've read in history has taught me, it's that women who can bring in money, women who make money for themselves and their families, have a whole different status in life than women who are confined just to being housewives and mothers. And it wasn't their doing. People were stuck in different things as they went along in history, and they moved to cities, stuff happened. But and I've wondered this about the fact that right now, since the 1970s, there's been this transformation of the economic role of women in America. It was in the 70s that suddenly, because of one thing or another, married middle-class couples could no longer support their lifestyle with just one income. And women really had to think about working their entire lives, not for ideological purposes, but just to have the standard of living they wanted. And once you got to that point and women started to be economically important, everything changed. But the women also have to go into the workplace. They're expected to, and they're in positions in relation to men that they never were before. I mean, I don't know if in the entertainment business, there would have been that much interaction between men and women who were working behind the scenes maybe 40 years ago, and that's a danger as well as a great blessing in some ways. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, I think that not just the work, not just sort of are women, in some ways this may be stating the obvious, right? But it's not just like, are women working and taking home paychecks, but what positions are they holding within various industries? I thought, in trying to figure out how it was that the Weinstein, in 2015, 2015 was actually one of the rare moments when at least one allegation against Harvey Weinstein burst into public view, when this model, this model from Italy had reported to a work meeting at his office here in Manhattan, and within hours of leaving had gone to the New York Police Department and said, I was just sexually abused by this producer. And there weren't charges brought at the time, but there were headlines. And so we knew that the Weinstein company, the other executives in his company, and the board of outsiders overseeing the company were aware of that. And in the course of our reporting, we realized that in that year, they also had learned of other allegations, that there was actually a junior executive in the company who actually submitted a scathing memo outlining all of this alleged harassment and abuse by Weinstein that the board saw. And so what did they do that year? They renewed his contract. They renewed Weinstein's contract. And to try to figure out how something like that could have happened, I always thought that it was very interesting to note that the board of Weinstein's company there was not a single woman on that board. Mm. There was no woman on that board. And I always wondered, yes, there were women working in the company. Yes, there were even women in the company working at high levels. But there was nobody on the board. There was no women on the board. And what would it have looked like over the years if there had been actually women on that board who read those memos, who saw those headlines?
Yeah, it's such an important thing to think about, right? Women and our voices and what spaces we occupy and power. Both of your books have an undercurrent of the dynamics of power at play for women in the world and how much that matters. Megan, could you talk a little bit about the reception of your reporting and the reception of your book?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting. Jody and I, when we started the Weinstein investigation, we knew that there had been other journalists who had tried and failed to do the story. We would also learn sort of closer to the end that Ronan Farrow was also working on the story and close to the finish line as well. And so and there were times when we would be knocking on women's doors and contacting sources, people who had worked in Weinstein's companies or were otherwise in his orbit. And there were people who said, listen, you're not the first reporter we've talked to. There have been other journalists who've shown up on our doorstep. And in some cases, there were people who said, not only did they show up on our doorstep, but we talked to them. And then only to watch those stories, those reporting efforts die, come to like a screeching halt. And so we heard time and again, Weinstein is so powerful that he's going to actually find a way to kill your story. He's going to barge into the New York Times. He's going to get this, people just didn't have a lot of faith that this story was ever going to actually make it into print. And we would always say, listen, we can't speak to the experiences that you've had with other journalists or other news organizations, but we want you to know that when we show up on your doorstep, we're showing up with the entire support of the New York Times behind us. Up through the top editor, up through the publisher who were aware of the stories. And Weinstein was in fact contacting them. He was one of the many things he was doing to try to stop the investigation. But we as an institution were really committed to, if we were able to nail the facts, if we were able to get information that was publishable, that we were going to do that. And so I think that now that doesn't mean that we had any expectation of what would happen after that, after we were able to publish. In fact, there was this night, a couple nights before the story was published, Jody and I had been working around the clock, and we finally, left work, I think around midnight, and shared a cab back to Brooklyn. And it was in that kind of rare, quiet moment that we turned to each other, and I think I was the one who said to her, do you think anybody's actually going to read this story? We were sort of so in the midst of it, in the trenches at that point, that we couldn't, we just couldn't quite see what we had, or what, we just were so focused on trying to cut through everything that Weinstein was trying to do to stop the story, which we would later learn included hiring like former Israeli spies who adopted fake identities to try to dupe us and our sources. And so I think that our starting point was just pride that we got there, like that we were like, thank goodness, because the prospect of having heard all those stories of harassment and abuse, and this fear that we would sort of join the ranks of journalists who had seen that and heard those stories and not been able to publish was like too much to bear. We were just so terrified of that. So I think for us, upon the story being published, the reception, at least internally, was just like, yeah, we do, we got it. At least we were able to accomplish that. But in terms of the fact that within days, and within several stories of within several days of the story being published, Weinstein was fired from his own company, which was our first indication, like, okay, this may actually have an impact with regards to him. But in terms of having like a broader impact on the sort of culture, and that was something that we started to also feel within those first several days, when our emails and phones were flooded with women who were coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse, not necessarily in Hollywood, but like way beyond. And for reporters who have done, for any journalist who's worked on these stories of harassment and abuse, and to know how hard it is to try to extract those and bring them to light, this idea that all of a sudden, like, there'd been the river had reversed, right? And that there was now like this whole stream of information coming to us and people starting to step forward. And then also the moment a couple weeks in, when I finally had a moment to go on my Facebook page and started to see my own friends and family and colleagues sharing their stories directly under the Me Too hashtag. It was something I'll never forget it. It was so moving, and certainly something that we just never could have imagined. We certainly didn't predict.
Yeah, so I worked for many years at a crisis advocacy center working with survivors of sexual assault. And as I was reading your book, I thought a lot about those experiences. And that's such a micro, that's a one-on-one working with victims. And what you were doing was that kind of work on such a macro level. And when I was doing that work, it was a lot of responsibility, right? And it was heavy. That was heavy work. And so as I was reading your book, I thought a lot about what that must have been like for you and Jody to have been entrusted with those women's stories, to be entrusted with their hope, right? With their fears, and then of course in the moment, you don't know, that all of society is really depending on you to get this story out there and to make it happen and to make change in the world. But, I thought a lot about that while I was reading your book, and you mentioned it just a minute ago, but could you talk a little bit more about, what did the weight of this feel like for you? I mean, you've reported on President Trump, you've reported on a lot of heavy stuff, but what did the weight of this story feel like? And what did it mean to just get it into the world?
Yeah, I mean, well, you're right that there was a weight. It did feel like a grave responsibility to be carrying those, not only once for the women who did share their stories with us, and then there were the women who shared their stories with us, and then there were the women who went on the record, and that was a small number, but we were kind of carrying the stories of a fair number of women at that point, and especially the ones who were going to be going on the record and having their names associated with it. That's when you've got like the huge responsibility, because those are the people who are opening themselves up to everything that can happen. And right. I remember reporting on women who had come forward with allegations against then candidate Trump, and the death threats that they experienced, and having people on Fox News, take aim at them, and to have President Trump threaten to sue them. And so I was very aware that going on the record and putting yourself out there like this for the women who agree to be sources and go on the record in these stories is not done lightly, and can come with real risk. And so it is absolutely, if you look at the kind of landscape of reporting that I've done, and I think I can speak for Jody as well, like this was one where you really did feel, people will often ask us, especially when it's when they learn that there were these former spies who were on our trail and trying to stop us, and there were these powerful lawyers like David Boies who and others who were threatening to sue us. And people have asked us, like, were you ever afraid for yourselves? And we always say, no, we weren't. I mean, as investigative reporters at the Times, you kind of wake up, it's the reason we get out of bed in the morning is try to hold powerful people to account, and expecting that they're going to engage in all those, in a certain amount of tactics to try to stop you prevent scrutiny. But I think the real fear was not for ourselves, but that somehow the women who were working with us on the story were going to be harmed or suffer as a result. And
Sure.
that made publishing all the more important because oftentimes the best protection for sources is to have that story out for public view, because then there's so much more that somebody like Harvey Weinstein can do behind the scenes when he's trying to stop an investigation. But once it's in public view and he's the one in the hot seat, it becomes much more difficult for him to go after the people who have been, who have sort of bravely spoken out.
Gail, I'm going to pivot to you in a way that there's not going to be any connection to the question I'm about to ask you. But
I'm not talking about speaking out. Come on.
I know we can keep talking about Harvey Weinstein for the rest of this session, but Gail, I have so many questions I want to ask you as well. So Gail, you have written several books. You wrote for the New York Times, for I think close to 2 decades. You are on the Pulitzer Prize board. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to anybody who may be listening who is an aspiring author. And then Megan, I'm going to ask you the same question about being an aspiring journalist. But for anybody who's listening who might be an aspiring author, an aspiring journalist, could you speak a little bit to, what advice would you have for young women who are looking to you and the career that you've had and the stories that you've managed to put down on paper? What advice would you have for young women who see this and who want to do what you've done?
I do one other sort of slightly off thing, and I'll throw it to Megan, who has more about right now. But when back in the 70s, women started filing around the country suits to get more representation at work, to get more promotions, to get considered the same way that men were. And at the Times, it happened in the 70s too, and in the 80s. And in all of these instances, almost, the women who filed the suits were never the ones who got the reward because they'd been there a long time, they hadn't been promoted, they got in people's faces, so they weren't the most popular always. And what happened was when the suits were won, when companies came to realize the importance of that sexual diversity, people like me, who were the next ones coming in through the door, got enormous opportunities because all those other women had made the companies ready and eager to have that kind of diversity. And the women who really did it for us never get, I think, as much celebration as they could, because, you always want to talk to the first person who did whatever it was. But that whole behind thing is just, it's just so important to remember. No, go ahead, Megan.
Right. Well, and you were the first woman.
Amen.
Yeah. Yes. And you were the first woman to be appointed as the editor of the editorial page at the New York Times, right? So, so you were in there breaking down doors, shattering glass ceilings.
It's true. And you have to be able, when the glass ceiling gets shattered, to do whatever it is you need to do to make it work. But I just want one more diversity story about how people other than me got this done. When I was on the editorial board and I was a columnist, one day Hal Raines, who was then the editorial page editor, came in and said to me, we're going to change everything around. I'm going downstairs. We want you to become the editorial page editor. And I said, that's a crazy idea. I really haven't had that much experience, doing stuff like that. And it just, the first one, it just seemed like it should be somebody with a lot more background. And he just looked at me and said, this is possibly the last first woman thing that's going to be available for a while because they're falling fast. And if you want to be the first woman at something, unless you're planning to become the baseball commissioner, this is the time you've got to do it. Take this job. And he was so right. I'm very grateful.
Well, and that's, I think that's good for young people to hear too, that, I think probably most people suffer from imposter syndrome, right, as we call it today, where you feel, and I think women especially, feel like, oh, well, maybe you're not quite qualified for that thing. Maybe you need a little more experience. And, most men don't suffer from imposter syndrome. It's really us, and we feel it. But we're ready, and we're there, and we dig in, and we do the work. And you get to be the first editorial page editor as a result. So,
the one thing that I do tell younger women when the stuff that I did earlier on, I covered the state capitol in Connecticut for weekly newspapers for like 10 years. It was ridiculous. But I learned so much because I had to work so hard. We were working. Trish Hall was my partner and I for about 20 hours a day sometimes, just trying to get 25 papers, little stories about all the things that were going on. And they weren't great stories, but you get to a point where you're just used to doing stuff, where you've got the basic skills. And you can't sort of demean those basic skill learning times, even though they're not maybe the most exciting and creative things you'll ever do. That's really, really important. Just feel very comfortable with your work.
Yeah. Megan, I'm going to shoot a similar question over to you, because I think, one day there is going to be a movie about what you've done here, and Angelina Jolie is going to play you. And there are going to be a lot of women in this country who are going to say, how can I be an investigative journalist like Megan and Jody? How do I do this? How do I right wrongs? How do I bring powerful people down? For anybody who is watching this out there, who is looking at you and saying, I want to do that. I want to be that. I want to have that kind of impact on the world. What advice, what lessons would you have for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, for one, it's interesting to hear Gail talk about her time working in Maryland, did you say? Connecticut, excuse me, Connecticut, yeah. I too spent time working in my first newspaper job was at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. I worked in a suburban bureau, almost like a rural bureau of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
I wrote obituaries there once. That's great. Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
Yeah.
Well, and Gail moved to Marquette, right? So Gail. Yeah. Anyway, keep going.
So I learned, people will refer to this as like paying your dues. And I think that that's one way to look at it. I mean, another way to look at it is to just always be looking for the jobs where you're going to learn the most. And like where you're going to be forced to work hard and to learn and to grow. And those, when you're starting off, I may say that's rarely going to be that's really probably going to be starting out at a place like the New York Times or it's sort of, I would say there are jobs that come with prestigious titles and with prestigious organizations, employers. But I really do believe, and I really do feel like when I was squaring off against Harvey Weinstein in a conference room of the New York Times when he barged into the New York Times uninvited the day before the story was going to be published with his powerful lawyers by his side. I not only took that meeting, but was not intimidated by it in the slightest because of all of the interviews that I had done over the years, going back to the small town administrator in Racine County, Wisconsin, who was somebody who, even though he was a public official, didn't think he had to answer questions from a reporter, and his office would literally hang up the phone on me when I called. And I had to figure out how to get answers and how to get him on the phone and how to hold him to account. And so I just think that there's no substitute. I would just 100% echo Gail and say that there's no substitute. I think to become, if you want to become an investigative journalist, if you want to just do good journalism, period, there's no substitute for taking the kind of jobs where you're just like on the ground doing the work and like developing those reporting and writing muscles that are going to serve you well. Because when it came to not just Weinstein, but in some of the tougher interviews that I did with Trump, when I went to interview him about the women who had had allegations of sexual misconduct against him, and he was calling me a disgusting human being and screaming at me on the phone. I mean, there was no part of me that was rattled in these interviews because of the experience I had had as a cub reporter, working in some of the non-glamorous places, just doing the work.
Right. And, I think it's good for people to hear too, that even in the midst of this world changing reporting that you were doing, you weren't sure any of it was going to stick, much less start a movement. And I think that's important for people to hear, that you do the good work, you dig in, and, you hope it has the impact that you hope it will have. But that doesn't stop you from doing the good work. You do it because it's the right thing to do. I have one last question for you. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Megan.
No, I was just going to say, and you do it with the hopes that it's going to, not that it's going to bring attention to you, but that it's going to bring attention to the people that you're writing about. That Harvey Weinstein is going to get fired from his company, and that those women who participated in the story will walk away thinking that was the right thing to do. That did hold power to account. That did make a difference.
Yeah. So I'm going to take us to our last question. I can't believe that our time is already up. This has gone by so fast. I could talk to you both for the rest of the evening. But to wrap us up here, the National Book Festival this year, this is the 20th anniversary, which is such a phenomenal milestone and just really speaks to how much this festival resonates with folks across the country, and how important it is to have a space to get together and share ideas and sit with like-minded people and think about new things. And the theme of this year's festival is American ingenuity. So I'm wondering, before we wrap up, if I could ask you both just to speak to that theme of American ingenuity. How does it relate to your book? How does it not relate to your book? What does that mean to you? That phrase, that thought, is there power behind that for you? Gail, could we start with you? What does American ingenuity, how does that connect for you?
It's a sort of a freedom, because in this country, once you get to a position where people notice what you're doing and are paying attention to it, which is tricky sometimes, but people are ready to listen and accept and to give you credit for stuff because of the way the history of the country has gone. And, and on the woman's side, I mean, just think of all of the women who did all the stuff that they got no credit for whatsoever over all of our history. And all you can do is just remind people of who all these other people were and sort of go back on those tracks and think about that a little bit. And then, just as we've said, work like a crazy person doing basic things until you're comfortable. And then that's all there is.
Yep. Megan, what about for you? American ingenuity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if I think about it, when we were doing the Weinstein investigation, and I guess that another one of the reasons that we wrote this book, to go back to one of your original questions, is because I think that there's no question that in doing the Weinstein reporting, we saw a lot of darkness. We reported into a lot of darkness. We got a very close look at abuse of power and sexual violence, and how powerful people are able to cover that up. But this was ultimately I think that another one of the reasons we wanted to write the book was that at a time when the country can feel so polarized, and when the very notion of truth feels like it's collapsing, that this was also an example of how brave sources, that this was a real testament to the power of brave sources and journalism and how facts can win. And I think that it was also ushered in this new, to watch what happened in the months and the year that followed, and is still happening, to see that in some ways we were just using the same investigative techniques that journalists have been using for years and years and years, but to see victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault be able to kind of step up into a new space in this country and use journalism to to help bring about change, I think was so inspiring to watch and to also participate in.
Yeah. Well, American ingenuity, I would certainly say that applies to both of you and the work that you've done. Thank you so much, Gail and Megan, for joining me for this conversation. To everybody to everybody who is watching the National Book Festival this weekend, we're so glad that you are taking part in these conversations. These are amazing books. Please check them out. I encourage you, there's so much in these books about women's lives and women's stories. And in this centennial year where, we're really celebrating women's history, this is a moment to learn. This is a moment to listen. And this is a moment to engage in women and our lives, and to just really look at each other and be grateful for the work that we've all done, and to, look to the next 100 years and think about the work that we still have left to do. So Gail and Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us.